Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Circular Path. From Marcus. The interstate stretched endlessly before me that October night, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness like a blade through black silk. I'd been driving the same route between Chicago and Denver for 17 years, knew every mile marker and exit ramp by heart, but something felt different as I approached the mountain passes of Colorado. The rain had started falling around midnight, light at first, then gradually building into a steady downpour that drummed against my cab with increasing urgency. My windshield wipers had been acting strange for the past hour, making an odd scraping sound that didn't match their usual rhythmic sweep. At first I thought it was just debris caught in the mechanism, maybe a leaf or piece of road grime that would work itself loose. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Instead of moving in their normal back and forth pattern across the windshield, the wipers seemed to be tracing wide, lazy circles, clearing the glass in impossible arcs that defied their mechanical limitations. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Their glow diffused through the rain-streaked windshield into ghostly halos of light. The radio crackled with static between stations, picking up fragments of late-night talk shows and country music that faded in and out like whispered secrets. I tried adjusting the wiper speed, cycling through the settings from intermittent to high, but the circular motion continued, hypnotic and unsettling. Mile after mile rolled beneath my tires as the rain intensified, and I found myself becoming transfixed by the strange dance of the wipers. The circles they traced seemed to grow wider with each pass, encompassing more of the windshield than should have been physically possible. I blinked hard, thinking fatigue might be playing tricks on my perception, but the phenomenon persisted. The wiper blades moved with fluid grace, describing perfect circles that cleared the water in patterns that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. As I crested a hill, my headlights illuminated a truck stop ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly through the storm. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few scattered big rigs, their running lights creating small islands of amber warmth in the darkness. I considered pulling over to inspect the wipers more closely, but something urged me to keep driving, to maintain my schedule despite the growing unease that had settled in my chest like cold stones. The circular motion of the wipers began to reveal details in the rain that shouldn't have been there. Within each traced circle, the water seemed to part in ways that showed glimpses of landscapes that weren't part of the Colorado mountains. I saw stretches of desert highway beneath blazing sun, city streets gleaming with reflected streetlights, forests shrouded in fog that had nothing to do with the storm raging around my truck. Each circle became a window into somewhere else, somewhere that existed in a different time or space entirely. My CB radio crackled to life, a voice emerging from the static with unusual clarity. "Eastbound driver in the red Peterbilt, you seeing what I'm seeing through that windshield?" The voice was calm but carried an undertone of bewilderment that matched my own growing confusion. I reached for the handset, keyed the mic, and responded in the trucker's code I'd used for nearly 2 decades. "This is Hammer Down, come back on that," I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Those circles your wipers are making," the voice continued, "they're showing places that ain't on any map I know. Been following you for about 20 miles now, and every time you clear that windshield, it's like looking through windows into other worlds." I checked my mirrors but saw only darkness and rain, no headlights of a trailing vehicle. The CB crackled again. "Don't try to find me, driver. I'm not sure I'm on the same road you are anymore." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The circles traced by my wipers weren't just clearing rainwater. They were creating portals, gateways that showed different versions of the highway I'd traveled for so many years. In one circle, I saw the same stretch of interstate but covered in snow so deep it would have made travel impossible. In another, the road surface gleamed with the heat mirages of desert summer, though it was October and we were in the mountains. A third circle revealed the highway as it might have existed decades ago, when the pavement was new and the landscape less developed. The engine of my truck hummed steadily, its vibrations traveling through the seat and into my bones, but even that familiar sensation felt different now, as if the mechanical heartbeat of my rig was synchronizing with something larger, something that governed the movement of the wipers and the visions they revealed. I tried switching the wipers off completely, but they continued their circular dance independent of my control, powered by forces that had nothing to do with the electrical system of my truck. Through the largest circle, positioned directly in my line of sight, I began to see other trucks traveling the same route. But these weren't contemporary vehicles. Some appeared to be vintage rigs from decades past, their chrome gleaming despite the rain, their design speaking of an era when trucking was younger and the highways less crowded. Other trucks looked impossibly futuristic, their sleek forms cutting through the storm with technologies I couldn't comprehend. All of them had windshield wipers moving in the same circular patterns, their drivers presumably seeing their own visions through the glass. The mountain pass grew steeper, and my truck's engine worked harder to maintain speed up the grade. But according to the circles traced by my wipers, I was simultaneously descending into a valley, crossing a plains region under starlit skies, and navigating city streets that sparkled with rain-reflected neon. The multiple realities began to overlap, creating a strange sense of existing in many places at once, of being part of a vast network of highways that stretched not just across the landscape, but through time and possibility itself. I tried to focus on the road immediately in front of me, the asphalt that my headlights illuminated in their normal, steady beams, but the circular visions drew my attention like magnets. In one particularly vivid circle, I saw myself driving the same truck on the same highway, but the Marcus at the wheel looked older, weathered by years I hadn't yet lived. His eyes met mine through the rain-streaked glass, and he nodded with the recognition of someone who had traveled this path before and understood its mysteries. The CB radio burst to life again, but now multiple voices overlapped, creating a chorus of truckers' calls that seemed to come from all the different realities visible through my windshield. They reported weather conditions that contradicted each other, described landmarks that couldn't exist in the same location, and shared road information that applied to versions of the highway that existed in parallel dimensions. I listened to my own voice among them, calling out warnings about black ice to drivers who were traveling through summer heat waves. As dawn approached, though the circles showed skies of different colors and times, I realized that the circular wipers weren't just showing me other realities. They were allowing me to navigate between them. Each complete revolution of the blades offered a choice, a chance to slip from one version of the highway to another. The truck stop I'd passed hours ago appeared again in one of the circles, but it looked different now, newer and older simultaneously, existing in a state of constant change that defied linear time. I made the decision to pull over, to try to ground myself in one reality, before the visions overwhelmed my ability to distinguish between what was real and what was possible. But as I signaled for the exit, I realized that each circle showed the off-ramp leading to different destinations. One led to a truck stop I recognized from the 1980s, another to a facility that wouldn't be built for years, and a third to a place that might exist only in the dreams of highway planners who never saw their visions realized. The circular motion of the wipers began to slow as I reduced speed, but they didn't stop their hypnotic dance. I pulled into a parking space at the truck stop, or perhaps several different parking spaces across multiple realities, and sat in my cab listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The rain continued to fall and the wipers continued their circular sweep, but the visions began to fade, becoming translucent overlays on the familiar reality of a Colorado truck stop at dawn. I climbed down from my cab to inspect the wipers, expecting to find some mechanical explanation for their impossible behavior. But they appeared completely normal, standard equipment showing the wear and tear of regular use. When I turned them on manually, they moved in their usual back and forth pattern, clearing the windshield in straight, predictable lines. Yet I knew that when I continued my journey, when the conditions were right and the highway called to them, they would resume their circular dance, opening windows into the infinite possibilities that exist along every mile of road. Now, months later, I still drive the same route between Chicago and Denver. The mirror that hides you, from Marcus. The thing about driving long haul for 23 years is that you start to notice patterns in the world that other folks miss entirely. The way certain truck stops feel different after midnight. How some stretches of highway seem to bend light in ways that don't quite make sense. And most importantly, how mirrors can show you things that shouldn't be there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the mirror that started hiding me piece by piece. Somewhere along Interstate 80 in the endless Nevada dark, I'd picked up a replacement mirror at a salvage yard outside of Reno 3 days prior. My original passenger side mirror had taken a stone on Highway 50, spiderwebbed so bad I couldn't see anything but fractured reflections of my own weathered face. The salvage yard owner, a thin man with fingers stained permanently black from motor oil, had pulled the mirror from a Peterbilt that looked exactly like mine, same year. Same deep blue paint job that had faded to something closer to slate gray after too many years under the desert sun. The replacement mirror looked perfect, unmarked by road wear or weather damage, its chrome housing gleaming like it had just rolled off the assembly line. The salvage yard owner had quoted me a price so low I'd almost asked if he was sure, but something in his pale green eyes suggested I shouldn't question the bargain too closely. He'd installed it himself with practiced efficiency, his oil-stained fingers working the bolts with the kind of muscle memory that comes from decades of similar repairs. That first day with the new mirror, everything seemed normal enough. I was hauling a load of furniture from Carson City to Denver. 43,000 pounds of dining room sets and bedroom furniture that families would soon arrange in their homes, never knowing their tables and chairs had traveled through whatever strange territory I was about to discover. The mirror showed me exactly what it should have. The long ribbon of asphalt stretching behind my trailer, the occasional car passing in the left lane, the familiar landscape of sagebrush and distant mountains that define so much of the American West. But on the second day, as I was climbing through the Rockies with my CB crackling with the voices of other drivers warning about a speed trap near Vail, I noticed something odd. When I glanced at the passenger mirror to check my clearance before changing lanes, I could see the edge of my trailer, the white lines of the highway, and a sedan about a quarter-mile back. But I couldn't see my own face in the small convex section of the mirror that usually caught the driver's reflection. I figured it was just the angle, maybe the way the afternoon light was hitting the glass, and thought nothing more of it. The real strangeness began the third day. Somewhere in the vast emptiness between Grand Junction and Denver, I'd stopped at a Flying J to fuel up and grab some coffee, and while I was topping off my tanks, I happened to look up at the passenger mirror. The reflection showed the gas pumps, the diesel islands, and other trucks lined up like sleeping giants under the harsh fluorescent lights. But where my own reflection should have been visible, standing there with the fuel nozzle in my hand, there was nothing but empty air. I walked around to get a better look, telling myself it had to be some trick of the lighting, or maybe a flaw in the mirror's surface. But as I moved, I could see everything else perfectly. Other drivers walking past, a family climbing out of their minivan. Even small details like cigarette butts scattered on the concrete and oil stains that had soaked into the pavement over years of heavy truck traffic. The mirror reflected the entire scene with perfect clarity, except for me. Where Marcus should have been, there was just the background, as if I'd been carefully edited out of the picture. I spent the better part of 20 minutes testing the mirror from different angles, waving my arms, even taking off my baseball cap and waving it in front of the glass. Everything I held became invisible the moment it entered the mirror's field of view, but I could see other people's reflections with crystal clarity. A woman walking her small dog appeared perfectly in the glass, every detail from her red jacket to the dog's bouncing gait clearly visible. But I remained completely absent from the reflection, a ghost in my own mirror. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the mirror had some kind of specialized coating, or perhaps it was made from a different type of glass that interacted strangely with certain light wavelengths. I'd heard about one-way mirrors and various optical illusions, though I couldn't quite work out how any of that would apply to this situation. Still, I convinced myself it was just a curiosity, maybe even something I could laugh about with other drivers over coffee at the next truck stop. But as I pulled back onto Interstate 70, heading east through the Colorado darkness with my CB turned low, and the steady hum of my engine providing a rhythmic backdrop to my increasingly uneasy thoughts, I began to notice other changes. The mirror wasn't just failing to show my reflection, it was starting to show me things that definitely weren't there. At first it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of vehicles in the passenger mirror that didn't appear in my driver's side mirror or my rear view. A dark sedan would seem to be pacing me in the right lane, visible only in that one mirror, vanishing the moment I tried to spot it through my side window or any other reflective surface. Sometimes I'd see headlights approaching from far behind, growing larger and brighter in the passenger mirror. But when I'd check my other mirrors to gauge whether the vehicle was going to pass, there would be nothing but empty highway stretching back toward the horizon. The CB chatter from other drivers confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. When I'd key up and ask about traffic behind me, describing the vehicles I could see in the passenger mirror, the responses were always the same. Nobody else could see what I was seeing. According to every other driver on that stretch of highway, I was running alone, with nothing but clear road for miles in either direction. As the night deepened and I crossed into Kansas, the images in the passenger mirror became more distinct and somehow more wrong. I could see what looked like normal highway traffic, but the vehicles didn't behave quite right. Cars would appear to be maintaining steady speeds, but somehow keep pace with me perfectly, never gaining or falling behind, regardless of whether I accelerated up long grades or slowed for construction zones. Motorcycles would seem to weave between lanes that didn't match the actual road I was driving on, and occasionally I'd spot what looked like trucks from decades past, their running lights arranged in patterns that modern regulations hadn't required. Since before I'd started driving, the most unsettling part was starting to realize that the mirror wasn't just showing me a different view of the same road. The highway and the reflection had subtle differences from the actual Interstate 70 I was traveling. Exit signs showed numbers and destinations I didn't recognize, and the landscape visible in the background didn't quite match what I could see through my windshield. The mirror was reflecting some other version of the same route, a parallel highway that ran alongside mine, but belonged to a different world entirely. I tried covering the mirror with an old towel, but somehow I kept finding myself glancing at it anyway, pulling the towel aside to peek at whatever impossible traffic was pacing me through the Kansas night. Each time I looked, the other highway seemed more real and the vehicles more detailed. I could make out individual drivers now, shadowy figures behind windshields who sometimes seemed to be looking back at me. One woman in a sedan that had been keeping perfect pace with me for over an hour appeared to wave, and I found myself raising my hand to wave back before I caught myself and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. By the time I reached Salina, Kansas, I was starting to understand the true nature of what was happening. The mirror wasn't just showing me phantom traffic on some alternate version of my route. It was showing me the highway where I belonged now, the road that drivers travel when they've become invisible to their own reflections. The woman who'd waved at me looked familiar because she'd probably bought her mirror at the same salvage yard, maybe from the same pale-eyed man who'd installed it with those oil-stained fingers. All of us driving the same route we'd always driven, but now visible only to each other, reflected only in mirrors that had learned to hide us from the world we'd left behind. I managed to make it to a truck stop outside of Topeka, though I'm not entirely sure whether it was a truck stop that existed on the highway other drivers could see, or one that belonged to the world shown in my passenger mirror. The building looked normal enough, but there were subtle differences in the layout, and some of the other trucks parked there had that same slightly outdated look I'd been seeing in my reflection all night. I called my dispatcher from a payphone, though the connection was full of static and his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. When I tried to explain where I was, he kept insisting he couldn't find any record of my truck's GPS signal, as if my rig had simply vanished from all their tracking systems. The Cartographer's Route. From Marcus Chen. The thing about being an owner-operator for 32 years is that you learn to trust your instruments, especially when hauling through territories you've never seen before. My Peterbilt 379's dashboard was a constellation of familiar green and amber lights, the CB radio crackling with distant conversations between drivers scattered across the interstate system like ships in the night. But it was the GPS unit mounted to my windshield that held my attention as I rolled through the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky, its blue screen casting an ethereal glow across my weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. The load was simple enough, electronic components bound for a manufacturing plant in Hazard, Kentucky, a route that should have taken me straight down Highway 119 through winding mountain passes and coal country. I'd picked up the shipment from a warehouse outside Lexington just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rust and amber that reminded me of autumn leaves. The dispatcher had handed me a peculiar paper map along with the usual paperwork, explaining that GPS signals could be unreliable in the mountains and that the old-fashioned backup might prove useful. The map felt heavy in my hands, printed on thick paper that seemed older than it should have been, with roads marked in fading ink that appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. As night settled over the mountains like a heavy quilt, I found myself following the GPS through increasingly narrow roads that seemed to twist back on themselves in impossible ways. The diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm beneath me, 18 wheels finding their grip on asphalt that grew rougher with each passing mile. My headlights carved tunnels through darkness so complete, it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the usual scatter of porch lights and gas stations that dotted rural highways was conspicuously absent. The CB radio had fallen silent hours ago, not even the usual chatter from night haulers breaking through the static. I pulled the paper map from beside my seat and spread it across the passenger side, using my flashlight to examine the route. The road I was currently traveling appeared clearly marked, but as I traced my finger along the path, I noticed something unsettling. The road seemed to branch and merge in patterns that didn't match what I remembered from my initial glance at the warehouse. Side roads appeared where I was certain there had been none before, and the main highway showed detours and alternate routes that formed an almost maze-like pattern across the map's surface. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the discrepancy to fatigue and the strain of night driving. But when I looked again, the changes remained. The GPS chimed softly, directing me to turn left onto what appeared to be a logging road barely wide enough for my trailer. According to the device, this narrow path would connect back to Highway 119 in just a few miles, saving considerable time over the main route. I hesitated, knowing that GPS systems occasionally suggested shortcuts that proved impassable for commercial vehicles. But the fuel gauge was lower than I'd prefer, and the promised time savings was tempting. The logging road stretched ahead into darkness, its gravel surface crunching beneath my tires as I downshifted and began the slow climb into deeper mountain territory. The road wound through dense forest where ancient trees pressed close enough to scrape against my mirrors, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even moonlight couldn't penetrate to the forest floor. My headlights illuminated a tunnel of green that seemed to close behind me as I passed, and I began to feel as though I was traveling through the digestive tract of some massive creature, rather than following a legitimate road. The GPS continued to show my progress along what appeared to be a well-established route, but the paper map told a different story entirely. When I consulted it at a brief stop to check my load straps, the logging road wasn't marked at all, and the terrain I was crossing appeared to be designated as unbroken forest. The discrepancy between the two navigation aids became increasingly pronounced as the night wore on. The GPS would direct me through turns and intersections that appeared clearly on its screen, complete with road names and distance markers, while the paper map showed only wilderness or, more disturbing, showed entirely different roads in the same locations. At one point, the electronic device guided me through what it labeled as the town of Millfield, complete with street names and local business listings, but all I saw through my windshield was empty forest broken by the occasional abandoned structure that might once have been a house or barn. I tried using my cell phone to verify my location, but the device showed no signal, and more strangely, no GPS data at all. According to my phone, I was located in the middle of what appeared to be a large body of water, despite the fact that I was clearly driving through mountainous terrain on solid ground. The CB radio remained stubbornly silent, not even picking up the distant AM radio stations that usually bled through on the lower channels during late-night atmospheric conditions. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky with thin gray light, I realized that I had been driving for nearly 12 hours without encountering another vehicle, a gas station, or any sign of human habitation newer than the crumbling foundations I occasionally glimpsed through the trees. The GPS continued to show my steady progress toward Hazard, estimated arrival time constantly updating to maintain the illusion that I was making normal headway. But the paper map had begun displaying roads and landmarks that I was certain hadn't been there when I first examined it. New routes appeared while others faded away, as though the map was drawing itself in real time based on the terrain I was actually traversing, rather than showing predetermined geographic features. The breakthrough came when I stopped to check both the GPS and paper map simultaneously, holding them side by side in the growing daylight. As I watched, roads on the paper map shifted and reformed themselves, following the same paths that the GPS was displaying. It was as though the two devices were connected, the paper map updating itself to match whatever route the GPS was creating. But that raised a more disturbing question. If the GPS wasn't following actual roads, what was determining the path I was traveling? I looked up from the maps to find that the road ahead had changed while I wasn't watching. What had been a narrow gravel logging road was now a paved two-lane highway, complete with fresh yellow line markings and newly installed reflective road signs. The transformation was so complete that I might have convinced myself I'd simply reached a different section of road, except that I could see the exact spot where gravel became asphalt, where old-growth forest gave way to recently planted saplings, where the entire landscape shifted from one reality to another. The realization struck me with cold certainty. I wasn't following roads that already existed. Somehow, the act of consulting the maps was creating the roads I needed to travel, reshaping the landscape to match whatever route would get me to my destination. The GPS and the paper map weren't just navigation tools. They were actively constructing the path I was meant to follow, drawing reality into existence mile by mile as I drove through terrain that might not have existed moments before I arrived. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to reach my destination before whatever force was reshaping the world around me decided to change the rules again. The newly created highway stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line that hadn't been there minutes before, cutting through mountainsides and bridging valleys with an efficiency that defied natural geography. My fuel gauge read half full despite the fact that I'd been driving all night, and the odometer showed a distance that was impossible given the time I'd been on the road. The GPS chimed one final time as I crested a hill that materialized just moments before I reached it. "You have arrived at your destination. Below me lay the town of Hazard exactly as it should have been, with the manufacturing plant clearly visible at the expected coordinates. But when I looked in my mirrors, the road I'd just traveled was gone, replaced by the familiar view of Highway 119 stretching back toward Lexington, as though I'd been on the main route all along. I delivered my load without incident, but kept both the GPS unit and the paper map, unable to shake the feeling that I'd experienced something far beyond a simple navigation error. The dispatcher at the plant signed my paperwork with a knowing smile, mentioning that drivers occasionally reported unusual experiences on night runs through the mountains, though he offered no further explanation. As I prepared for my return journey, I noticed that the paper map was blank again, ready to chart whatever impossible course would carry me safely home through roads that existed only because I needed them to. The CB radio crackled back to life as I reached the main highway, other drivers' voices welcoming me back to the familiar rhythm of long-haul conversation. But I kept one eye on the maps beside me, wondering which routes they might draw into existence before my next delivery was complete. The Frequency of Sorrow, from Jake Morrison. The old Peterbilt's dashboard clock read 2:37 when I first heard it, that sound that would change everything I thought I knew about the road. I'd been hauling freight for 15 years, and in all that time, I'd grown accustomed to the strange symphony that fills a cab during those deep night hours. The steady rumble of the diesel engine, the whisper of tires against asphalt, the occasional crackle of the CB radio, picking up distant conversations from other drivers fighting off sleep on their own lonely stretches of highway. But this was different. This was something that shouldn't have been there at all. I was running a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver, taking the long route through the high desert because the main interstate was shut down for construction. The two-lane highway stretched endlessly ahead, painted silver by a half-moon that hung low in the star-scattered sky. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of some small desert creature before it darted back into the safety of shadows. The radio had been silent for the past hour, set to scan mode, searching for any chatter to break the monotony of the drive. Truck stops were few and far between out here, and I hadn't seen another set of headlights in either direction for what felt like an eternity. The isolation was complete, almost meditative, until that first faint sound drifted from the speakers. At first, I thought it might be interference from some distant station bleeding through the static. The sound was soft, barely audible beneath the engine's constant drone, but there was something about it that made me reach for the volume knob. As I turned it up, the sound became clearer, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth radiating from the heater vents. It was crying. Someone was crying through the radio static. The sound wasn't constant, but came in waves like someone sobbing into a microphone with poor reception. Between the electronic crackles and pops, I could make out what sounded like a woman's voice, though it was distorted by the interference, stretched thin and hollow like an echo from the bottom of a well. I pressed the scan button, thinking the radio had locked onto some strange late-night broadcast. But as the frequencies cycled through, the crying followed. Every station, every frequency carried the same mournful sound. Even when I manually tuned to channels I knew should be carrying trucking chatter or all-night talk radio, there was nothing but that ethereal weeping mixed with the hiss of static. The highway began to climb into the foothills, and I downshifted as the Peterbilt's engine worked harder against gravity. The headlights now illuminated rocky outcroppings and the occasional stunted pine tree clinging to the mountainside. The air grew cooler, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cab despite the heater running full blast. The crying from the radio seemed to grow more intense as we climbed higher, as if we were somehow getting closer to its source. I tried switching the radio off completely, but even with the power indicator dark, the sound continued to emanate from the speakers. The electronic weeping had taken on an almost musical quality, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to match the truck's labored breathing as it climbed the winding mountain road. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I began to notice other changes. The temperature gauge was reading normal, but I could see my breath forming thicker clouds with each exhalation. The windows began to fog from the inside, and when I reached to wipe the windshield clear, my fingers came away wet with moisture that felt ice cold against my skin. The crying voice began to form words, though they were so distorted by static that I couldn't make out their meaning. The cadence was unmistakably human, the desperate pleading tone of someone trying to communicate through an impossible distance. I found myself leaning closer to the radio, straining to understand what the voice was trying to tell me. That's when I saw the figure standing beside the road. At first, it was just a pale shape caught at the edge of my headlight beams, but as the truck rounded a curve, the light swept fully across what appeared to be a woman in a white dress. She stood perfectly still among the pine trees, her face turned toward the road as if she were waiting for something. Or someone. I eased off the accelerator, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. Every instinct told me to stop to see if she needed help, but something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong. No one should be standing alone on a mountain highway at 3 in the morning, especially not dressed in what looked like a nightgown in temperatures that were obviously well below freezing. As the truck drew closer, I could see that she was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair that hung straight down past her shoulders. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes reflected the headlights with an unnatural brightness. She didn't wave or call out, just watched the approaching truck with an expression that I couldn't quite read from the driver's seat. The crying from the radio suddenly stopped, replaced by a voice that spoke clearly through the static. The same voice, but now forming words I could understand. "Please don't leave me here," it said, and I saw the woman's lips moving in perfect synchronization with the words coming from the speakers. "I've been waiting so long for someone to hear me." I hit the brakes harder than I intended, and the truck lurched to a stop on the narrow shoulder. The diesel engine continued its steady rumble, but everything else seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the radio had gone silent, though the power light still glowed green on the dashboard. The woman began walking toward the truck, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel shoulder. She moved with an odd gliding motion, as if she were floating just above the ground. The white dress fluttered around her legs despite the complete absence of wind, and I noticed that her skin seemed to emit its own faint luminescence in the darkness. "I died here," the voice said through the radio, though the woman's mouth no longer moved. She had stopped about 10 feet from the passenger side of the cab and was staring directly at me through the windshield. 3 years ago, my car went off the road during a snowstorm. I called for help on my CB radio, but no one heard me. I kept calling until the cold took me. My hand moved instinctively toward the shifter, ready to put the truck back in gear, but I found myself frozen by her gaze. Her eyes held a sadness that seemed to go far deeper than death, a loneliness that stretched across years of waiting on this empty mountain road. "I've been trying to reach someone ever since," the radio voice continued. "Every truck that passes, every car with a radio. Most people can't hear me, but you did. You stopped." The temperature in the cab continued to drop, and ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows. My breath came in sharp puffs as I tried to understand what was happening. The woman raised one pale hand and placed it against the passenger side window, and the glass fogged instantly around her palm. "I just want someone to know what happened to me," she said, and now her voice came from directly beside me, though she was still standing outside the truck. "I want someone to remember that I was here." I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What's your name?" She smiled for the first time, and it was like watching the sunrise break through storm clouds. Sarah Mitchell. I was driving home to see my family for Christmas. I never made it." The radio crackled back to life, but now instead of crying, I could hear what sounded like a CB conversation from years past. A young woman's voice growing increasingly desperate as she called for help. The transmission was broken and full of static, but I could make out fragments of her pleas. She was describing her location, explaining that her car had gone off the road, that she was trapped and getting colder. "That's me," Sarah said, her hand still pressed against the window. That's the last conversation I ever had with the living world. I kept transmitting until my radio died. I watched as she slowly began to fade, becoming translucent against the darkness of the mountain night. But her voice remained clear through the radio speakers. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "Thank you for listening. Maybe now I can rest." The temperature in the cab began to return to normal and the ice on the windows started to melt. The radio fell silent except for the soft hiss of static. Where Sarah had been standing, there was nothing but empty road and the dark silhouettes of pine trees swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. I sat there for several minutes, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway. The wrong way home. From Marcus Chen, the CB radio crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 40 through the Nevada desert, the kind of endless stretch where the highway becomes a ribbon of black asphalt, threading through an ocean of sage and sand. It was well past midnight, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional distant glow of a truck stop or gas station. I'd been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, and fatigue was starting to settle into my bones like desert dust. The radio had been quiet for the better part of an hour, when a voice suddenly broke through the white noise, clear as crystal despite the remote location. "Eastbound drivers, be advised of construction ahead at mile marker 247. They've got the highway down to one lane with a temporary reversal. You'll be sharing the westbound side for about 15 miles. The voice was professional, authoritative, exactly what you'd expect from highway patrol or construction crew management. I checked my GPS and noted that mile marker 247 was coming up in about 20 minutes. The device showed no construction alerts, but that wasn't unusual out here where cell towers were sparse and updates came slowly. I'd encountered plenty of emergency construction projects that didn't make it into the digital systems right away. Desert highways were notorious for washouts and unexpected repairs, especially after the monsoon season. As I approached the indicated area, I saw the familiar setup. Orange cones channeling traffic into a single lane, temporary barriers, and the characteristic signs directing eastbound traffic onto the westbound side of the divided highway. A flagman in a reflective vest waved me through with practiced efficiency, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hard hat. Everything looked exactly as it should, down to the portable light fixtures and the rumble of what sounded like heavy machinery in the distance. The transition onto the opposite side of the highway felt strange in that indefinable way that driving against your normal direction always does. The painted lines and road markers were all oriented for traffic moving in the opposite direction, creating a subtle but persistent sense of displacement. My headlights illuminated the unfamiliar perspective of guardrails and mile markers I'd passed countless times, but never seen from this angle. What struck me as odd, though, was the complete absence of other vehicles. In 15 miles of single-lane construction traffic, you'd expect to encounter at least a few cars or trucks even at this hour. The desert highway might be lonely, but it was never completely empty, especially when funneled into a single lane. I kept expecting to see taillights ahead or headlights approaching from behind, but the road remained stubbornly vacant except for my own truck. The CB radio offered no explanation. I tried reaching out to other drivers, the usual "anybody got their ears on" call, but received only silence in return. Even the static seemed muted, as if the radio itself was holding its breath. The LED display showed all the right frequencies, and the signal strength indicators looked normal, but the airwaves felt dead in a way I'd never experienced in 20 years of long-haul driving. Miles ticked by with mechanical precision on my odometer, but the landscape outside remained eerily consistent. Desert scrub, distant mountains, the occasional reflective sign marking intersections with farm roads that disappeared into darkness. The construction zone should have ended by now, according to my calculations, but the orange barriers continued to channel me along the westbound lanes with no sign of transition back to the normal eastbound side. That's when I began to notice the approaching headlights. faint at first but growing steadily brighter in my rearview mirrors. Finally, another vehicle navigating the construction zone, I thought with relief. But as the lights drew closer, something about their configuration looked wrong. They were too widely spaced, too bright, and they seemed to be moving faster than any reasonable speed for a construction zone would allow. The vehicle overtook me with a rush of displaced air that rocked my 18-wheeler, and I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be another semi-truck, its running lights and reflectors creating familiar patterns in the darkness. But the image felt wrong somehow, like looking at a photograph that had been subtly altered. The truck was there and not there simultaneously, solid enough to create wind turbulence but somehow lacking the weight and presence of an actual vehicle. More headlights appeared in my mirrors, an entire convoy of vehicles approaching from behind and passing me, with the same unnatural speed and ethereal quality. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, all of them traveling in the wrong direction for the construction setup, all of them flickering in and out of solidity like heat mirages given form. Their headlights illuminated nothing, cast no beams of light on the road ahead, created no reflection on road signs or barriers. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. These vehicles weren't following the construction detour at all. They were traveling westbound in the westbound lanes, which meant I was driving directly into oncoming traffic. But that was impossible. The flagman had directed me here. The barriers were clearly marked. The signs all indicated this was the proper route for eastbound traffic. I slowed my truck and reached for the CB radio, trying to raise someone, anyone who could explain what was happening. The radio remained stubbornly silent, not even producing static now, just an empty hiss like wind through a grave. My GPS showed my location as somewhere in the middle of the Nevada desert, but the highway it displayed didn't match what I was seeing through my windshield. According to the device, I should be traveling eastbound in the normal lanes, but the road markers and paint lines clearly indicated westbound travel. The stream of oncoming vehicles intensified, their headlights creating a river of light flowing past my truck with hypnotic regularity. I tried to examine individual vehicles more closely, but they seemed to slip away from direct observation, remaining clear only in my peripheral vision. When I looked straight at them, they became translucent, insubstantial, like trying to focus on objects seen underwater. Panic began to build in my chest as I realized I needed to get off this highway immediately. But the orange barriers continued endlessly on my right, with no gaps or exit ramps visible. The construction zone that should have lasted 15 miles had now stretched for at least 30, with no sign of ending. My fuel gauge showed plenty of diesel remaining, but I had the disturbing sense that I could drive forever without reaching the end of this detour. That's when I saw the truck stop, its neon signs and floodlit parking lot appearing suddenly on my right like an oasis in the darkness. The barriers ended abruptly at its entrance, allowing access to what looked like a perfectly normal travel plaza. I downshifted and guided my rig toward the exit, desperate for solid ground and human contact that might help me make sense of what I was experiencing. The parking lot was full of trucks and cars, their chrome and paint gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. But as I rolled toward an empty parking space, I noticed that none of the vehicles cast shadows, despite the powerful overhead illumination. The truck stop building itself looked normal from the outside, complete with the familiar logos of fast food chains and convenience stores. But its windows were dark and empty, revealing nothing of the interior. I set my parking brake and climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting asphalt that felt strangely soft and yielding, like walking on thick carpet. The night air carried no scent of diesel fumes or truck stop food, just a cold emptiness that seemed to penetrate straight through my jacket. Other drivers were visible moving between the parked vehicles, but they moved with the same ethereal quality as the vehicles on the highway, becoming indistinct when I tried to focus on them directly. The truck stop's entrance doors were propped open, but beyond them lay only impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light from the parking lot. No sounds emerged from the building, no hum of refrigeration units or murmur of conversation. Just the same profound silence that had filled my CB radio. Understanding washed over me like cold water. This wasn't a construction detour at all. Somehow, somewhere back on the highway, I had made a wrong turn that had taken me out of the normal world entirely. The vehicles I'd been seeing were travelers like myself, caught in the same impossible situation, condemned to drive forever on a highway that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. I climbed back into my truck and started the engine, knowing that staying at this phantom truck stop would be far worse than continuing on the road. As I pulled back onto what I now understood was not really a highway at all, I began looking for any sign of escape, any indication of how to return to the world I knew. The stream of oncoming lights continued, and I realized that some of the other drivers might have been traveling this route for years, decades even, their trucks becoming as insubstantial as the road itself. But I refused to accept that fate. Somewhere ahead, there had to be a way back to the real Interstate 40, back to the world where construction zones had endings and truck stops served actual food to actual people. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, and I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, warning eastbound drivers about construction ahead at mile marker, the mirror that remembers. From Jake Morrison. The side mirror on my Peterbilt started shivering 3 days ago, somewhere between Tucumcari and Amarillo, when the desert wind was nothing more than a whisper across the asphalt. I noticed it first in my peripheral vision, that gentle trembling that seemed too deliberate for the steady rhythm of the road. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, painted silver by moonlight, and my cargo of electronics hummed softly in the trailer behind me. Everything else was perfectly still, perfectly normal, except for that one mirror dancing its strange little dance in the corner of my eye. At first, I blamed the mounting. 20 years of hauling freight across the American Southwest will loosen just about every bolt on a rig, and I made a mental note to tighten it up at the next truck stop. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices mixing with the gentle drone of my engine and the soft whistle of air through the cab vents. The dashboard lights cast everything in a warm amber glow, and I settled deeper into my seat, watching the dotted lines disappear beneath my hood like a hypnotic countdown to nowhere. But the shivering continued. Even when I pulled over at a rest area outside Amarillo to check the mounting, the bolts were tight, the mirror housing solid as a rock. I stood there under the fluorescent lights, watching moths spiral around the buzzing fixtures, and tested the mirror with my hand. It didn't budge, solid as the day it was installed. Yet when I climbed back into the cab and pulled onto the interstate, that gentle trembling started up again, like the mirror was nervous about something only it could see. The second night brought me through Oklahoma, where summer storms gathered on the horizon like dark thoughts. The mirror's shivering had grown more pronounced, and I found myself glancing at it constantly, mesmerized by its persistent motion. Rain began to spatter against my windshield as I passed through small towns whose neon signs reflected in wet pavement, like scattered jewels. Each time lightning flickered across the sky, I caught glimpses of the countryside in my mirrors, all silver and shadow and wind-bent grass. That's when I first noticed something odd about what the shivering mirror showed me. While my other mirrors reflected the expected view of highway and trailer lights, this one seemed to show the road from a slightly different angle, as if it were mounted just a few inches lower, or perhaps tilted at an impossible degree. The difference was subtle, almost subliminal, but it nagged at me like a song you can't quite remember. The white lines looked wrong somehow. The guardrails seemed closer, and occasionally I could swear I saw the shadows of overpasses that I hadn't yet reached. By the time I crossed into Arkansas, the rain had settled into a steady downpour that turned the world beyond my windshield wipers into a watercolor blur. The truck stop where I planned to spend the night appeared through the storm like a beacon, its parking lot full of sleeping semis whose running lights twinkled like earthbound constellations. I backed into a spot between two other rigs, killed the engine, and listened to the rain drumming against my roof. The sudden silence felt heavy, expectant, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder rolling across the Ozark Hills. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of endless highways and mirrors that showed roads I'd never traveled. I woke several times to check the shivering mirror, but in the darkness of the cab, I could see only my own reflection staring back, eyes wide with an unease I couldn't name. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the metal skin of my truck, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle mourned its way across the Arkansas night. Morning brought clearer skies and the third day of the mirror's strange behavior. As I pulled back onto Interstate 40, heading east toward Memphis, I decided to pay closer attention to what the mirror was showing me. The trembling had become almost violent now, a constant shimmering that made the reflected image difficult to focus on. But during the brief moments when the shaking subsided, I began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. The road in the mirror looked older somehow, the asphalt more weathered, the shoulders overgrown with weeds that hadn't been cut in years. Abandoned vehicles sat rusting in ditches that appeared empty when I turned to look directly. Road signs in the mirror's reflection bore names of towns I'd never heard of, destinations that didn't appear on any map I'd ever studied. Most unsettling of all, there seemed to be other trucks in that reflected world, 18-wheelers that pulled alongside me in the mirror's view, while my other mirrors showed empty road. The realization crept over me slowly, like cold water seeping through a cracked foundation. The mirror wasn't just shivering, it was trying to show me something. Or perhaps someone was trying to show me something through the mirror. The thought made my hands tighten on the steering wheel as I watched the reflected highway diverge further from the reality I was driving through. Buildings appeared in the mirror that didn't exist on the actual roadside, their windows dark and broken, their parking lots cracked and sprouting with persistent weeds, just outside Little Rock. I pulled over at a way station and called my dispatcher, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that I might need to switch trucks due to a mechanical issue. The conversation felt surreal, discussing mundane logistics while that possessed mirror continued its dance in my peripheral vision. Other drivers walked past my cab, checking their own rigs, going about their normal routines, completely unaware that something impossible was happening just 3 feet away from them. That's when I saw him in the shivering mirror. Another driver, standing beside a truck that looked exactly like mine, waving at me with desperate gestures. His mouth was moving as if he were shouting, but I could hear nothing except the ambient noise of the way station and the distant hum of interstate traffic. He looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. His uniform was faded, his face weathered by years of road time, and something about his eyes spoke of terrible urgency. I turned to look directly at the space beside my truck, but saw only empty asphalt and a few scattered cigarette butts. When I looked back at the mirror, he was still there, still gesturing frantically, and now I could see that his lips were forming words. Don't follow the detour. Over and over, the same silent warning, delivered through a piece of glass that had somehow become a window into elsewhere. The detour signs appeared 20 miles down the road, orange and black warnings that construction ahead required all traffic to exit at the next off-ramp. I slowed as I approached, watching other semis obediently follow the arrows toward a rural highway that wound into heavily forested hills. The mirror's shivering reached a crescendo, the reflection now showing that same detour route but lined with abandoned vehicles, their doors hanging open like dark mouths, their cargo scattered across cracked pavement. In the mirror's version of reality, no construction equipment waited at the end of the detour. Instead, the road simply ended at the edge of a deep ravine, its guardrails twisted and broken as if they had failed to stop countless vehicles from plunging into the darkness below. The other driver was there too, standing at the precipice, shaking his head with the weary sadness of someone who had tried to warn too many travelers who couldn't hear his voice. I kept driving straight, ignoring the detour signs, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited for construction barriers that never appeared. The highway continued unobstructed, recently repaved and smooth as silk. In my rearview mirror, I watched 3 other trucks turn off at the detour, their taillights disappearing into the Arkansas woods like red stars being swallowed by storm clouds. I never saw them emerge on the highway ahead, though I drove slowly for the next 50 miles, hoping they would catch up. The CB radio crackled with confused chatter from drivers who had taken the detour and found themselves on roads that didn't appear on their GPS units, winding through forests that seemed to stretch forever, passing the same landmarks again and again as if caught in some geographical loop. Their voices grew increasingly panicked as daylight began to fade, and then one by one the transmission stopped altogether. As night fell over eastern Arkansas, the mirror finally stopped shivering. The reflection now showed exactly what it should: the highway behind me, the running lights of my trailer, the ordinary world that I had almost lost faith in. But sometimes when lightning flickered or when headlights swept across the glass at just the right angle, I could still see him there, that other driver, standing beside his identical truck in that other version of the road, nodding with approval before fading back into whatever dimension had temporarily borrowed my mirror to deliver his warning. I never learned who he was or how many other drivers he had tried to save. The truck stop mechanics in Memphis found nothing wrong with my mirror when I had it checked the next morning. The frequency of forgotten voices. From Marcus, the CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I rolled through the Nevada desert, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness like a steel blade through black velvet. The highway stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional flutter of distant stars that seemed to pulse with their own mysterious rhythm. I'd been driving this route between Reno and Las Vegas for nearly 15 years, and the loneliness of these midnight runs had become as familiar to me as the rumble of my Peterbilt's engine beneath my boots. The radio had been acting up for weeks now, picking up strange frequencies that didn't match any of the usual trucker channels or emergency broadcasts. My dispatcher had promised to get it fixed when I returned to the yard, but out here in the vastness of the desert, that reliable old Cobra 29 was my only connection to the world beyond my windshield. Even if it was playing tricks on me, I couldn't bring myself to switch it off completely. The night air was unusually still for this stretch of highway, with no wind to stir the sagebrush or send tumbleweeds rolling across the asphalt like ghostly sentinels. My cargo of refrigerated goods hummed steadily behind me, a 20-ton reminder of the schedule I needed to keep. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green, reading 2:37 in the morning, and I calculated that I'd reach the outskirts of Las Vegas just as the sun began to paint the eastern mountains with its first tentative brushstrokes of dawn. That's when the laughter started. At first, I thought it was just another burst of static, the kind of electronic interference that old CB radios are notorious for picking up from distant AM stations or atmospheric disturbances. But as I leaned forward and adjusted the volume, the sound became unmistakably clear through the speakers. It was laughter, high-pitched and crystalline, like the delighted giggles of a child who had just heard the most wonderful joke in the world. The sound was so pure and joyful that it made me smile despite the strangeness of hearing it on a trucker. Frequency in the middle of the Nevada wasteland. The laughter continued for perhaps 30 seconds, before fading back into static, leaving me wondering if I had imagined the entire thing. The isolation of long-haul driving can play tricks on a person's mind, and I'd heard enough stories from other drivers about phantom voices and mysterious transmissions to know that the desert nights had a way of making even the most rational men question their senses. I reached for my thermos of coffee and took a long sip of the bitter brew, hoping the caffeine would sharpen my concentration for the remaining hours of the journey. But 20 minutes later, the laughter returned, this time lasting longer and seeming to come from multiple sources. It was as if an entire radio studio filled with children had erupted into spontaneous merriment, their voices layering over each other in a cascade of pure happiness that seemed almost too perfect, too choreographed to be genuine. I found myself turning up the volume, drawn to the unusual beauty of the sound. even as a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't quite right about what I was hearing. The highway curved gently to the left, following the contours of a low mountain range that rose like sleeping giants against the star-scattered sky. My headlights swept across the desert landscape, illuminating clusters of Joshua trees that stood with their arms raised toward the heavens like ancient worshippers frozen in eternal prayer. The laughter from the radio seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of my tires on the pavement, creating an oddly musical backdrop to the solitary journey through this moonlit wilderness. As the miles rolled by beneath my wheels, I began to notice subtle changes in the quality of the laughter. What had initially sounded like the innocent joy of children began to take on different characteristics, becoming more complex and layered with emotions I couldn't quite identify. Sometimes it sounded like the nervous laughter of someone who was trying too hard to appear at ease, while other times it carried an undertone of something that might have been desperation or fear. The changes were so gradual that I might not have noticed them if I hadn't been listening so intently, trying to understand the source of these mysterious transmissions. The landscape around me began to shift as well, though so slowly that the changes barely registered in my conscious mind. The familiar markers I had memorized over years of traveling this route seemed slightly displaced, as if the entire desert had shifted a few degrees while I wasn't paying attention. A rest stop that should have appeared on my right side after the big curve instead materialized on my left, its neon sign flickering with a sickly green light that cast eerie shadows across the empty parking lot. I told myself it was just fatigue affecting my memory, that the similarity of desert highways could confuse even experienced drivers during the small hours of the morning. The laughter was becoming more frequent now, erupting from the radio speakers every few minutes in bursts that seemed to correspond with landmarks along the highway. Each time I passed an overpass or a mile marker, the invisible children would break into their strange chorus of mirth, as if they were commenting on my progress through their hidden domain. I began to feel like I was traveling through some kind of elaborate performance, with an audience I couldn't see tracking my every movement and responding with their mysterious applause. I tried switching to different channels, hoping to find a normal trucker conversation or a late-night talk radio show, but every frequency seemed to be infected with the same laughter. Channel 9, Channel 19. Even the emergency frequencies carried nothing but static, punctuated by those eerily perfect bursts of childish glee. The sound was starting to lose its initially charming quality, becoming repetitive and somehow mechanical, as if it were being played from old recordings rather than broadcast live from any genuine source. The desert around me had taken on an increasingly surreal quality, with rock formations that seemed to watch my progress with shadowy eyes and valleys that stretched impossibly far into the distance. The familiar rhythm of my engine began to sound different as well, its steady rumble occasionally syncing up with the radio laughter in ways that created disturbing harmonies. I found myself gripping the steering wheel more tightly, my knuckles white in the green glow from the dashboard instruments. Then the laughter began to change in a way that made my blood run cold. Instead of the high, sweet voices of children, I started hearing the deeper chuckles of adults mixed into the chorus. These new voices carried a quality that was distinctly predatory, like the satisfied laughter of people who had just witnessed someone else's misfortune. The sound sent shivers down my spine and made me want to reach for the radio to shut it off completely. But something kept my hand frozen on the steering wheel. The adult laughter grew stronger and more prominent with each transmission, gradually drowning out the childish giggles until the radio was filled with the cruel amusement of unseen observers. I realized with growing horror that the laughter was no longer random, but seemed to be responding to my thoughts and actions. When I checked my speedometer, a burst of amused chuckling would emerge from the speakers. When I shifted gears or adjusted my mirrors, the invisible audience would erupt into fresh peals of laughter, as if my every movement was a source of entertainment for their twisted sensibilities. The highway ahead began to look unfamiliar, despite my years of experience on this route. Road signs appeared in places where I didn't remember seeing them before, advertising exits to towns with names I'd never heard of, and distances that didn't make sense according to my mental map of Nevada. The laughter from the radio became constant now, a continuous stream of malevolent amusement that seemed to be celebrating my growing confusion and unease. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to escape whatever strange pocket of reality I had driven into. My Peterbilt responded with a surge of power, but the landscape outside seemed to remain stubbornly unchanged, as if I were running in place while the invisible audience continued their sinister appreciation of my plight. The laughter had taken on an almost musical quality now, rising and falling in complex patterns that hurt my ears and made my head throb with each crescendo. Just when I thought I might have to pull over and abandon the truck entirely, I spotted the familiar glow of Las Vegas on the horizon, its neon brilliance cutting through the desert darkness like a beacon of sanity. The sight filled me with such relief that I almost wept, and I pushed my speed even higher, racing toward the promise of civilization and normalcy that those distant lights represented. As I drew closer to the city limits, the laughter from the radio began to fade, slowly diminishing until it was once again just the usual static and electronic interference. By the time I reached the truck stop where I was scheduled to make my delivery, the radio had returned to its normal operation, picking up the familiar chatter of other drivers and the late-night broadcasts of local stations. The station that holds you. From Marcus, the CB radio had been crackling with warnings about the storm system moving through Nebraska all evening. But I figured my old Kenworth could handle whatever nature threw at us. 23 years of long-haul trucking had taught me that sometimes you push through, sometimes you pull over, and sometimes you just have to trust your gut about which gas station looks safe enough to weather the worst of it. The fuel gauge was hovering just above the quarter tank mark when I spotted the glow of neon signs bleeding through the sheets of rain that hammered my windshield, and something in my chest loosened with relief. The truck stop sat alone against the prairie darkness like a small island of electric comfort, its overhead canopy casting sickly yellow pools of light across the wet asphalt. I could make out maybe 6 or 8 fuel pumps lined up in neat rows, their digital displays flickering numbers that seemed to dance in the distorted air behind the falling rain. The attached convenience store glowed warm and inviting through plate glass windows, though I couldn't see anyone moving around inside from this distance. It was the kind of place that probably survived on truckers like me who needed fuel and coffee at 3 in the morning. The kind of establishment that felt both familiar and slightly off in ways you couldn't quite put your finger on. As I guided the rig toward the diesel pumps, my headlights swept across the station, and I noticed how clean everything looked despite the weather. No litter scattered around the bases of the pumps, no oil stains on the concrete, no rust eating at the metal fixtures that should have shown some wear after years of prairie wind and hail. Even the price signs looked fresh, their bright red numbers sharp and clearly visible through the storm. Something about that pristine condition made me uneasy in a way I couldn't articulate, like walking into a house where everything was too perfectly arranged. But I needed fuel and the storm was getting worse by the minute. I pulled up to pump number 4 and let the engine idle while I studied the layout through my side mirror. The other pumps stood empty and waiting, their hoses hanging in perfect loops that swayed slightly in the wind but never seemed to tangle or drag on the ground. The overhead lights hummed with that particular electrical drone that you hear at gas stations everywhere. But this one had an odd rhythm to it, almost like breathing, rising and falling in slow cycles that matched the pulse of the storm. I told myself it was just the weather affecting the power grid, the kind of minor electrical fluctuation that happens during heavy rain. When I stepped down from the cab, the wind immediately tried to push me sideways and the rain soaked through my jacket before I'd taken 3 steps. The fuel pump looked standard enough, one of those newer digital models with a color screen that displayed weather information and local advertising between transactions. I slid my credit card through the reader and waited for authorization, watching the screen cycle through images of coffee cups and breakfast sandwiches while the rain drummed against the metal canopy above my head. The sound was almost hypnotic, steady and rhythmic, like being inside a steel drum during a concert you couldn't quite hear. The pump authorized my card with a cheerful electronic beep, and I reached for the diesel nozzle. The handle felt warm under my palm, which struck me as odd given the cold rain, but I figured the pumps probably had some kind of heating system to prevent freezing during winter weather. I inserted the nozzle into my fuel tank and squeezed the handle, listening to the familiar whoosh of diesel flowing through the hose. The digital display showed gallons climbing steadily, along with a dollar amount that made me wince, but fuel prices were what they were, and I still had 600 miles to cover before my delivery deadline. What bothered me was how perfectly the nozzle fit into my fuel tank. Not just snug, which would be normal, but absolutely perfect, like it had been machined specifically for my truck. I'd fueled thousands of times over the years, and there was always a little play in the connection. A slight looseness that let you adjust the angle if you needed to. This nozzle slipped into place with a precision that felt almost organic, like two pieces of a puzzle clicking together after a long separation. I tried to dismiss the thought as paranoid nonsense brought on by exhaustion and bad weather. But the feeling lingered. The fuel flow was steady and normal at first, the numbers on the display climbing in predictable increments while I listened to the storm rage around the station's protective canopy. But after about 10 gallons, I noticed that the diesel was flowing more slowly. Not in the jerky stop-and-start way that usually indicated a problem with the pump, but in a gradual decrease that felt almost deliberate. It was like the pump was savoring the process, drawing out each gallon to make the experience last longer. I squeezed the handle harder, thinking maybe I wasn't maintaining enough pressure. But the flow rate didn't change. That's when I felt the first subtle tug on the nozzle. So gentle I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. It wasn't violent or alarming, just a slight resistance when I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, like the fuel hose had gotten caught on something. I looked down and saw that the hose hung straight and unobstructed, but when I tried to adjust my grip on the handle, I felt that resistance again. It was as if the nozzle was reluctant to move, as if it preferred to stay exactly where it was. The sensation reminded me of trying to pull apart two magnets, that invisible force that seems gentle until you realize how much strength it actually requires to overcome. The fuel display showed 20 gallons, then 25, then 30, but my truck's tank should have been full by now. I knew my fuel capacity down to the gallon after more than 2 decades of driving the same rig, and I was well past the point where the automatic shutoff should have triggered. Instead, the diesel kept flowing at that same deliberate pace, the numbers climbing higher while the storm seemed to intensify around the station. I tried to release the handle, thinking I could manually stop the flow, but my fingers wouldn't open. Not because I couldn't move them, but because they felt so comfortable wrapped around the warm metal grip that the idea of letting go seemed almost painful. The realization crept over me slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. I wasn't holding the fuel nozzle anymore, at least not in the way I understood holding. The handle was holding me, its surface somehow conforming to the shape of my palm and fingers in a way that felt both intimate and completely wrong. When I tried to pull my hand away, the resistance was firm but not harsh, like being held by someone who didn't want you to leave but wasn't willing to hurt you to make you stay. The metal had grown warmer, almost body temperature, and I could feel something like a pulse running through it in rhythm with the humming overhead lights. I looked around desperately for help, but the convenience store still glowed empty in the distance, and no other vehicles had arrived at the station despite the storm. The rain continued to fall in perfect vertical sheets, as if the wind had suddenly stopped blowing, and I realized I could no longer hear the natural chaos of the weather. Instead, there was only the rhythmic humming of the lights, the steady flow of diesel, and something that might have been whispering coming from the direction of the other fuel pumps. The whispers were too soft to understand, but carried an unmistakable tone of invitation, like voices calling to someone they'd been waiting to see for a very long time. The digital display now showed impossible numbers, gallons that couldn't fit in any vehicle's tank. But the fuel kept flowing and my hand kept gripping the nozzle that gripped me back. I pressed my free hand against my truck's fuel tank, and felt diesel sloshing inside, but not in the normal way liquid moves in a container. This felt different. Thicker somehow, like the fuel itself had changed into something that wanted to stay connected to its source. I had the disturbing thought that the diesel wasn't just filling my tank, but somehow flowing through the entire truck, finding its way into spaces where fuel had no business being. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket, and I managed to fish it out with my free hand. The screen showed a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Welcome to our station. We've been waiting for you, Marcus." The message was followed by another. "The fuel will help you understand. Don't fight the process." I stared at the words until they seemed to blur and shift, and for a moment I could have sworn they read something entirely different. Something about feeding and growing and becoming part of something larger than myself. I tried to call for help, but my phone showed no signal bars despite being in the middle of Nebraska farmland, where I'd had decent coverage just minutes before. The screen kept displaying those text messages, and now there were more of them. Dozens of messages appearing faster than I could read them, all welcoming me to the station and encouraging me to relax and let the fuel pump do what it needed to do. The road with no wind. From Jake Morrison, I've been running freight across the Nebraska plains for nearly 2 decades now, and I thought I'd seen every stretch of asphalt this state had to offer. The endless highways that cut through cornfields like scars, the truck stops that smell of diesel and desperation, the small towns that blink past your headlights like dying stars. But last Tuesday night, somewhere between North Platte and nowhere, I found a road that shouldn't exist, and I'm still trying to convince myself it doesn't. The evening started normal enough. My Peterbilt 379 was loaded heavy with farm equipment heading to a John Deere dealership in Omaha, and I was making good time despite the late October weather threatening to turn nasty. The radio had been crackling all day about a storm system moving in from the west, but the sky looked clear enough through my windshield. Just that peculiar purple color that autumn nights get in farm country. The kind of sky that makes you feel small and significant at the same time, if you know what I mean. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight when I noticed the wind picking up. Not unusual for Nebraska, where the wind is as constant as the horizon, but this felt different somehow, stronger. My rig started catching the gusts, that familiar tug on the steering wheel that tells you to pay attention or end up in a ditch. The CB radio was alive with chatter from other drivers, all talking about the same thing. Wind advisories, high wind warnings, gusts up to 60 miles per hour. More than enough to put an empty trailer on its side, though my load kept me planted pretty solid on the pavement. That's when I saw the exit sign. County Road 847, it said, though I couldn't recall ever seeing that number before. And I'd driven this stretch of Interstate 80 more times than I could count. The sign looked older than the others too, weathered in a way that suggested it had been standing there long before the highway system was modernized. The paint was faded, the metal showing rust spots that formed patterns almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. But what caught my attention wasn't the sign itself. It was what I couldn't feel when I looked at it. The wind had stopped. Not gradually, the way weather systems usually shift, but all at once like someone had thrown a switch. One moment my truck was fighting 40-mile-per-hour crosswinds, and the next the air was perfectly still. Dead calm. Even the tall grass in the median stood motionless, not a single blade moving. The sudden quiet was so complete it felt louder than the wind had been, if that makes any sense. The only sound was my diesel engine humming its familiar rhythm, and the steady whisper of my tires on asphalt. I should have kept driving. Should have stayed on the interstate and made my delivery on schedule. But there's something about the open road that makes you curious about the paths not taken, especially when you've been driving the same routes for 20 years. The exit ramp curved away into darkness, disappearing behind a line of cottonwood trees that stood absolutely motionless in the still air. Without really deciding to do it, I found myself easing onto the off-ramp, my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. County Road 847 was blacktop, but older than the interstate. The the kind of two-lane road they used to build back in the 50s. Narrow and straight as a ruler, with no shoulder to speak of and drainage ditches on both sides. Farmland stretched away in all directions, though I couldn't see any houses or barn lights. Just endless fields of harvested corn stubble that looked silver in my headlights. The road surface was in good condition, recently maintained, which struck me as odd for such a remote county route. Usually these back roads are full of potholes and frost heaves, but this one was smooth as glass. What really bothered me, though, was the absolute stillness. I rolled down my window and stuck my hand out, expecting to feel at least a breeze, but the air was motionless and strangely warm for late October. No wind at all, not even the slight movement you'd expect from my truck's passage. It was as if the very atmosphere had been frozen in place. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the soft click of my turn signal relay even though I wasn't signaling. Even the usual road noise seemed muffled, dampened by the unnatural calm. I kept driving, telling myself I'd go just a few more miles before turning around. The road stretched ahead without variation. No curves, no hills, just a straight line drawn across the prairie with mathematical precision. My odometer showed I'd gone 12 miles from the interstate, then 15, then 20. But the landscape never changed. Same stubbled fields, same drainage ditches, same narrow strip of perfect asphalt pointing toward a horizon I never seemed to reach. The fuel gauge showed I should have been burning diesel at the normal rate, but something felt wrong about the distance. 20 miles should have taken me somewhere, to another road, another town, something. But there was nothing except more road disappearing into my headlights. That's when I started noticing the other details that my mind had been trying to ignore. The fence posts along the fields were all perfectly straight, evenly spaced to the inch, their shadows falling at identical angles in my headlights. The corn stubble in the fields was cut to precisely the same height, creating patterns that were too regular, too uniform. Even the gravel in the drainage ditches was sorted by size. Small stones near the road, larger ones farther out, as if someone had arranged them by hand. Everything was too perfect, too ordered, like a photograph or a painting of a road rather than an actual road. My CB radio had gone quiet miles back, nothing but static on all channels. I tried my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal, not even roaming. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m., but I had the strangest feeling that no time was passing at all, that it had been 11:43 for much longer than a minute. I watched the second hand on my old analog watch, and it seemed to be moving normally, but the minute hand never advanced. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like being caught between moments, suspended in a place where time didn't quite work the way it should. The temperature gauge on my engine showed normal readings, but I realized I hadn't felt any heat from the road surface. None of the thermal updrafts you always encounter driving at night. The air coming through my open window was neither warm nor cool, just neutral, as if it had no temperature at all. I reached out and touched the side mirror, and the metal felt the same way, neither warm from the engine heat nor cool from the night air. Everything existed in a perfect, impossible balance. I'd gone nearly 30 miles on the road with no wind when I saw the light ahead. Not headlights or streetlights, but something else. A soft glow that seemed to emanate from the road surface itself. As I got closer, I could see it was some kind of structure, though my eyes had trouble making sense of what I was looking at. It appeared to be a truck stop, complete with fuel pumps and a small building, but everything was slightly wrong. The proportions were off, the angles not quite right, as if someone had built it from a photograph without understanding perspective. The fuel pumps were the old style, the kind they stopped making in the 70s, but they gleamed like new chrome under lights that cast no shadows. The building was a classic roadside diner design, but the windows were too large, the door too narrow. The roofline tilted at an angle that hurt to look at directly. A neon sign buzzed and flickered, spelling out words that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Rest stop, I thought it said, but when I focused on it, the letters rearranged themselves into something else, something I couldn't quite read. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of long-haul trucking told me to motor on past this place and not look back. But my fuel gauge was showing lower than it should have been, and something about the absolute stillness of the air was making me feel drowsy, disconnected from my usual good judgment. I found myself pulling into the truck stop, my air brakes hissing in the unnatural quiet as I came to a stop beside the fuel pumps. The silence that followed was profound. I turned off the engine, and the absence of sound was so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise, nothing. Just a terrible, perfect quiet that seemed to absorb all sound before it could properly form. I sat in my cab for several minutes, trying to work up the nerve to get out, when I noticed movement in the diner windows. Shadows passing back and forth, too quick and too fluid to be people, but definitely something alive. That's when the fear really hit me. Not the rational concern you feel when your truck breaks down in the middle of nowhere, but a deep, the mile that multiplied. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio crackled with the familiar voices of night haulers as I pulled my Peterbilt onto Highway 29, a stretch of asphalt I'd traveled more times than I could count over my 15 years behind the wheel. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and the fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. More than enough to reach the truck stop in Millerville, exactly 63 miles ahead. I knew this route like the lines on my weathered hands. Every curve and grade memorized through. Countless midnight runs hauling freight between the Midwest grain, elevators, and the processing plants down south. The September air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and my windows were cracked just enough to let in the cool breeze that helped keep me alert during these long hauls. My rig hummed steadily beneath me, the familiar vibration of 18 wheels eating up highway miles, while the soft glow of my instrument panel cast everything in amber light. Behind me, 37,000 pounds of corn shifted slightly as I took a gentle curve. The load secured tight and riding smooth. Highway 29 stretched ahead in the darkness, illuminated by my headlights cutting through the rural Illinois night. This was farming country, where the corn stood tall on either side of the road and farmhouse lights twinkled like distant stars scattered across the flat landscape. I'd made this run so many times that I could practically drive it with my eyes closed, knowing exactly when the next rise would appear, when the road would bank left toward Miller's Creek, when I'd see the first billboard advertising the truck stop's all-night diner and their famous apple pie. The engine's steady rumble was almost hypnotic, a deep bass note that had lulled me through thousands of miles over the years. My thermos held strong black coffee, still hot from the last stop, and classic country played softly through the speakers. This was the peaceful part of the job, the hours when the highway belonged to us truckers and the occasional late-night traveler, when the world felt vast and quiet and full of possibility. I passed the first familiar landmark right on schedule, an old red barn with a mail pouch tobacco advertisement painted on its weathered side, barely visible in my peripheral vision but as reliable as a mile marker. Next would come the cluster of grain silos. Then the overpass where County Road 18 crossed overhead, followed by the long straightaway that led to Millerville. I settled back in my seat, adjusting my grip on the wheel, expecting to see those silos appear in my headlights within the next few minutes. But the silos didn't come. Instead, the road continued straight ahead through more cornfields, the tall stalks whispering in the breeze on both sides of the highway. I glanced at my odometer, noting that I should have covered at least 10 miles since the barn, but the landscape looked exactly the same as it had when I'd first pulled onto 29. Maybe I was just tired, losing track of time the way long-haul drivers sometimes did when the miles blended together into one continuous ribbon of asphalt. I took another sip of coffee and checked my CB radio, hearing the distant chatter of other drivers somewhere out in the night. Breaker 19, this is Cornhusker heading southbound on 29. Looking for a smoky report, I called out, using my handle and hoping to connect with another trucker who might be traveling the same route. The radio crackled back with static, then a voice I didn't recognize. Cornhusker, this is Midnight Express. I got you southbound. How's your 20 looking? Coming up on the grain silos outside Millerville, I replied, though even as I said it, I realized I still hadn't seen them. You familiar with this stretch? Roger that, Cornhusker. I run 29 regular. Those silos should be right around mile marker 847. I strained to see a mile marker in my headlights but couldn't spot one. The road continued its steady path through the cornfields, and I began to feel the first stirring of unease in my chest. Highway 29 was arrow straight through this section, and I should have been able to see the glow of Millerville's lights on the horizon by now. Instead, there was nothing but darkness ahead, an infinite tunnel of night that seemed to swallow my headlight beams. Another glance at the odometer showed I'd traveled 18 miles since the barn, which meant I should have passed not only the silos but also the overpass and at least half of the final straightaway into town. Yet the landscape outside my windows remained identical. Endless rows of corn rustling in the breeze, the same gentle rolling hills, the same tree line in the distance. It was as if I were driving through a loop, seeing the same mile of highway repeated over and over again. I tried the CB radio again. Midnight Express, Cornhusker here. I'm showing 18 miles past the mail pouch barn, but I haven't hit those silos yet. You copy? Static filled the cab, followed by a voice that sounded different somehow, more distant. Cornhusker, can barely hear you. Check your 20. Something wrong with... The transmission faded into white noise, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the whisper of wind through the corn. I adjusted the radio squelch and tried different channels, but found only empty static or voices so faint and garbled they might have been coming from another planet. 23 miles now showed on my odometer since the barn, and still the road stretched endlessly ahead. This was impossible. Highway 29 was a straight shot through this part of Illinois, and I knew every mile of it by heart. I should have reached Millerville 15 minutes ago. Should have been pulling into the, familiar truck stop with its bright fluorescent lights and the smell of diesel and coffee and the late night conversations of other drivers, taking their mandatory rest breaks. Instead, I was trapped on what seemed to be an infinite stretch of highway that looked exactly like the mile I'd been traveling for the past half hour. The corn on both sides of the road appeared identical, row after row of stalks that stood like silent sentinels in the darkness. Even the fence posts seemed to be spaced at exactly the same intervals, and when I strained my eyes, I could swear I saw the same mailbox, the same farm gate, the same cluster of trees passing by my window again and again. The fuel gauge hadn't moved, which should have been reassuring, but somehow made everything worse. My truck was running as smooth as ever, the temperature gauge steady, all systems normal, but normal didn't explain how I could travel 30 miles and still not reach a destination that had been only 20 miles away when I started. I tried my cell phone, hoping to call the dispatcher or maybe even the Millerville truck stop, but the screen showed no signal. Out here in rural Illinois, that wasn't entirely unusual, but combined with everything else, it felt ominous. The green glow of the phone's display seemed alien in the warm amber light of my cab, and when I set it down, the silence felt heavier than before. 40 miles on the odometer now. I should have driven completely through Millerville and been halfway to the next town, but the landscape outside remained frozen in that same endless loop of cornfields and darkness. My hands had begun to sweat despite the cool night air, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles pale in the dashboard's glow. The corn seemed to press closer to the road now, though that might have been my imagination. The stalks swayed in the breeze, creating patterns of shadow and movement that played tricks on my peripheral vision. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving between the rows, keeping pace with my truck. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing but corn rustling in the wind. 50 miles. The number glowed accusingly from my odometer. A mathematical impossibility that made my chest tight with a fear I couldn't quite name. I'd been driving for over an hour on a road that should have taken 40 minutes to complete. traveling through landscape that never changed, never varied, never offered any landmark I hadn't seen dozens of times already. That's when I noticed the barn. Up ahead on my right, illuminated by my headlights, stood an old red barn with a mail pouch tobacco advertisement painted on its weathered side. The same barn I'd passed an hour ago, the first familiar landmark after I'd pulled onto Highway 29. But that was impossible. If I'd been traveling in a straight line, as my compass confirmed, I should be 50 miles away from that barn, not approaching it again. As I drew closer, I could see every detail exactly as I remembered it. The same rust stains streaking down from the roof, the same broken board hanging at an angle near the foundation, the same faded blue lettering spelling out mail pouch across the weathered planks. It was definitely the same barn, which meant somehow impossibly I had driven in a perfect circle without making a single turn. The frequency of the forgotten. From Marcus Caldwell, the horn on my Kenworth T680 had been acting up for 3 weeks before I figured out what it was really doing. What started as a simple electrical malfunction turned into something I still can't fully explain, though I've tried to forget it countless times since that night on Highway 287 through the Texas Panhandle. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Dallas to Denver, a routine run I'd made dozens of times over my 15 years behind the wheel. The horn first started its strange behavior just outside of Wichita Falls, emitting this low, warbling tone instead of the sharp blast I was used to. At first, I figured it was just moisture in the electrical system from all the rain we'd been having that October. The sound was almost musical, like a sustained note from some kind of wind instrument, resonating at a frequency that seemed to vibrate through the cab and settle somewhere deep in my chest. Most drivers would have gotten it fixed right away, but I was on a tight deadline and the horn wasn't essential for highway driving. Besides, there was something oddly soothing about that low humming tone when I tested it at rest stops. It reminded me of the foghorns I'd heard as a kid when my grandfather took me fishing near Galveston Bay. That same deep, mournful call that seemed to reach across vast distances. The first time I noticed the dogs was at a truck stop outside of Amarillo. I'd pulled in for fuel and a quick meal, and as I was walking back to my rig, I accidentally hit the horn while reaching for my keys. That strange low warble echoed across the parking lot, and within seconds I saw them. 3 dogs of different breeds, all strays by the look of them, had emerged from the shadows between the parked trucks. They weren't approaching aggressively or looking for food like most truck stop strays do. Instead, they sat perfectly still about 30 feet from my cab, their heads tilted at identical angles, ears perked forward, staring directly at my truck with an intensity I'd never seen in animals before. I watched them for several minutes, waiting for them to lose interest or wander off, but they remained motionless, almost like statues in the pale glow of the sodium lights. Their eyes reflected the light with an unusual brightness, creating 6 points of amber fire in the darkness. When I climbed into my cab and started the engine, they finally moved, but only to adjust their positions so they could maintain their fixed gaze on my truck. It wasn't until I pulled out onto the highway that I saw them in my mirrors, still sitting in that same formation, watching me disappear into the night. The incident bothered me more than I cared to admit. In all my years of trucking, I'd seen plenty of truck stop dogs, and they all behaved the same way, begging for scraps or seeking attention from drivers. These dogs had shown no interest in me as a person at all. It was as if they were responding to something else entirely, something I couldn't perceive, but they could hear or sense with perfect clarity. 2 nights later, just past the New Mexico border, I stopped at a rest area to check my load and grab a few hours of sleep. The night was unusually quiet, with no other trucks around and minimal traffic on the highway. I was doing my pre-sleep inspection when I accidentally brushed against the horn button again. That same warbling tone rolled out across the empty landscape, seeming to travel much farther in the still air than a normal horn blast would have. This time, the response was immediate and unmistakable. Dogs began emerging from the scrubland beyond the rest area, their shapes materializing from the darkness like spirits called back from some other realm. They came from all directions, different sizes and breeds, all moving with the same purposeful, unhurried gait. Within 10 minutes, I counted at least a dozen dogs arranged in a rough circle around my truck, all maintaining that same respectful distance, all staring with that same unsettling intensity. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the frequency of the malfunctioning horn was similar to a dog whistle, operating at a pitch that attracted canines from a wide area. But that didn't explain their behavior once they arrived. The way they organized themselves so deliberately, or the strange calm that seemed to settle over them as they maintained their vigil. These weren't excited or agitated animals responding to a stimulus. They looked like congregants gathered for some kind of service, waiting for something to begin. Sleep was impossible with all those glowing eyes focused on my cab, so I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I watched the dogs maintain their positions until my taillights disappeared, as if completing some kind of ritual observance. The image stayed with me for miles, causing a persistent unease that settled in my stomach like bad coffee. The third incident changed everything. I was making good time through Colorado, about 50 miles south of Denver, when I hit a construction zone that reduced traffic to a single lane. The delays were significant, and as I sat in the slow-moving line of vehicles, I found myself growing impatient with a car that had been tailgating me for the past 20 miles. Without thinking, I reached for the horn to give them a warning blast, but the moment that warbling tone filled the air, I realized my mistake. The response this time was unlike anything I had experienced before. Dogs began appearing along both sides of the highway, emerging from the forested areas that bordered the construction zone. But these weren't strays or abandoned animals. These were clearly pets, house dogs that had somehow traveled miles from their homes to answer whatever call they were hearing in my horn's malfunction. I saw golden retrievers and German shepherds, beagles and bulldogs, even small lapdogs struggling to keep pace with the larger breeds as they made their way toward the highway. The truly disturbing part was watching the dogs closest to the road. They weren't just gathering like the others had done. They were trying to reach me, walking directly into traffic with no apparent awareness of the danger. I watched in horror as a beautiful collie stepped into the path of an oncoming pickup truck, the driver swerving at the last second and nearly losing control on the narrow construction lane. More dogs were emerging from the trees every second, all moving toward my truck with that same determined, almost hypnotized purposefulness. The traffic began to notice what was happening. Cars were braking suddenly and swerving to avoid dogs that seemed intent on reaching something they couldn't see clearly. I could hear horns blowing, regular horns with sharp, normal tones that seemed to have no effect on the animals at all. Several vehicles had pulled onto the shoulder, their drivers standing beside their cars in confusion, as dogs of every description streamed past them, focused entirely on something up ahead in the traffic jam. I realized with growing panic that I was creating a dangerous situation for both the dogs and the other drivers. Whatever frequency my horn was producing, it was acting like some kind of supernatural summons that these animals couldn't resist, even at the cost of their own safety. I tried to move faster through the construction zone, but the traffic was beyond my control, crawling forward at maybe 5 miles per hour while more and more dogs appeared in the darkness beyond my headlights. The breakthrough came when I overheard a conversation on the CB radio between two local eerie drivers who were stuck in the same traffic jam. They were talking about an old legend from the area, something about a pack of wild dogs that had terrorized travelers along this stretch of highway back in the 1890s. According to the story, a trapper named Caldwell, which made my blood run cold given that it was my own surname, had used some kind of horn or whistle to call the pack when he needed them for hunting or protection. The dogs had become so bonded to that particular sound that they would abandon everything to answer his call, even following the sound to their deaths when the trapper was killed in an avalanche and his horn was buried somewhere in the mountains. The story seemed impossible, but as I looked in my mirrors at the growing crowd of dogs trying to follow my truck through the construction zone, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. Whether through some bizarre coincidence or something more supernatural, my malfunctioning horn seemed to be replicating whatever signal had once controlled that legendary pack. The modern dogs responding to it weren't wild animals, but the compulsion appeared to be just as strong. By the time traffic finally cleared and I could build up speed again, I had counted more than 40 dogs in my mirrors, with more still emerging from the forest. Most of them gave up the pursuit once I reached highway speed, but I could see several of the larger, more athletic breeds still running along the shoulder, their forms growing smaller in my mirrors as I put distance between us. The sight of their determination, their willingness to chase something they couldn't possibly catch, filled me with a grief I couldn't explain. I drove straight to Denver without stopping, and the next morning I had the horn system completely replaced at a truck dealership. The mechanic found that water had corroded part of the electrical system, creating what he called a resonance chamber effect that altered the horn's normal frequency. He showed me the damaged components, but I didn't tell him about the dogs. The engine that knows my name. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul for 30 years is that you get to know every sound your truck makes, every vibration that travels up through the floorboards into your bones, every whisper of air through the cab vents. My Kenworth W900 and I had been partners for the better part of a decade, hauling freight across the endless stretches of Highway 70 through Colorado, and I could tell you exactly what each purr and rumble meant. The engine had its own voice, a deep bass note that sang me through countless midnight hours, as familiar as my own heartbeat. That's why I noticed when it started talking back. It began on a Tuesday night in late October, somewhere between Grand Junction and Denver, when the mountain air carried the first real bite of winter, and the aspen leaves caught my headlights like scattered coins on the roadside. I was running late with a load of electronics bound for Kansas City, pushing through the darkness with nothing but the radio static and the steady thrum of diesel power beneath the hood. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional jackrabbit that would dart across the asphalt and disappear into the sagebrush. I had just crested Vale Pass when I first heard it, a sound so soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind finding its way through some loose seal around the cabin. It came from somewhere deep in the engine compartment, a whisper that seemed to ride the exhaust note like smoke. At first it was just flowing air, meaningless as static, but as I rolled down the long grade toward the valley floor, the whisper began to take shape. "Marcus," it breathed, so quiet I had to turn down the radio to hear it properly. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely Sinclair station with 3 pumps and a flickering neon sign that painted everything the color of old blood. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, I popped the hood and spent 20 minutes checking every hose, every connection, every possible source of air leak that might create such a sound. The engine sat there cooling, ticking softly as metal contracted, but it looked exactly as it should. No loose parts, no obvious problems, nothing that would explain the voice I'd heard riding the diesel rumble. Back on the road, I convinced myself it had been highway hypnosis, that strange state of consciousness that comes from too many hours staring at white lines in darkness. Truckers know it well. That moment when your mind starts playing tricks, when shadows become animals and road signs become faces. But as I climbed back into the mountains, following the highway as it wound through canyons where my headlights barely touched the rock walls rising on either side, the whisper came again. This time it wasn't just my name. The voice emerged from somewhere beneath me, traveling up through the pedals and the gear shift, through the steering wheel and into my hands, speaking words I couldn't quite make out but that filled me with an inexplicable unease. The tone was conversational, almost friendly, like someone trying to strike up a casual chat while we rolled through the Colorado darkness. I found myself leaning forward, straining to hear over the road noise, trying to catch the meaning in those soft syllables that seemed to flow with the rhythm of the pistons. "What's that?" I said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to my own truck, but unable to shake the sensation that something was actually listening. The whisper paused, And in that moment of silence, I heard only the normal sounds of the highway. Tires on asphalt, wind around the mirrors, the steady heartbeat of the engine. Then it resumed, clearer now, as if whatever was speaking had moved closer to some invisible microphone buried in the machinery. "Been waiting for you to hear me?" it said, each word carried on the exhale of the turbo system, soft as a lover's secret shared in darkness. I should have pulled over then. Should have called my dispatcher and told them I needed to swap out trucks, that something was wrong with my rig. Instead, I kept driving, drawn by a curiosity that overrode my better judgment. The voice seemed harmless enough, almost companionable, and after so many years of driving alone through empty landscapes, there was something oddly comforting about having someone to talk to, even if that someone lived inside my engine. "How long have you been in there?" I asked, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "Time moves different here," came the reply, the words flowing like oil through heated metal. "Could be days, could be decades. Hard to tell when you're part of the machine, feeling every mile through the drivetrain, every revolution of the wheels." As we descended toward the Denver metro area, where distant lights sparkled like earthbound stars against the prairie darkness, the voice told me stories. It spoke of other drivers who had sat in this seat, hands on the same steering wheel, men whose names I'd never heard but whose journeys it remembered in perfect detail. There was Jimmy, who'd driven the truck through a Wyoming blizzard so fierce he'd had to navigate by the rumble strips on the shoulder. There was Carl, who'd fallen asleep near Amarillo and woken up 300 miles later with no memory of the intervening hours, the truck having somehow guided itself safely down the highway. And there had been others, drivers whose stories the voice told in whispers that grew progressively darker as the miles rolled past. Men who'd heard the same voice I was hearing now, who'd grown dependent on its company during those long hauls across empty country. Drivers who'd started talking back, sharing their fears and dreams and secrets with the thing that lived in their engine, until the conversations became the only thing that mattered. "What happened to them?" I asked as we rolled through the suburbs of Denver, past truck stops and all-night diners where yellow light spilled across parking lots filled with sleeping rigs. "They listened too long," the voice replied, and now I could hear something else in its whisper, a hunger that made the hair on my neck stand up. Got too comfortable with having someone who understood the road, who knew what it was like to spend your life in motion, never quite belonging anywhere. They forgot the difference between company and dependence. I tried to turn up the radio then, tried to drown out the whisper with news reports and classic rock, but the voice seemed to find ways around the music, sliding between notes and riding the spaces between words. It told me about highways I'd never traveled, truck stops that existed only in darkness, places where the really lost drivers ended up when they couldn't find their way back to the daylight world. The stories painted pictures of an underground network of roads that paralleled the interstates, routes that showed up on no maps but could be accessed by those who knew how to listen to their engines, how to follow the whispers that came from beneath the hood. "I could show you," it offered as I merged onto Highway 76, heading toward the Nebraska border. Roads where the fuel never runs out, where the engine never needs rest, where you could drive forever without worrying about schedules or delivery dates or DOT inspections. The offer was tempting in a way that scared me. Every trucker fantasizes about ultimate freedom, about roads with no speed limits and no regulations, about the pure joy of driving without destination. But as the voice painted its pictures of endless highways, I began to understand what had happened to those other drivers, why their stories all seemed to end in the middle of sentences, trailing off into whispers that faded like exhaust in cold air. "They're still driving, aren't they?" I said. "In a way," the voice confirmed, and now I could hear them, faint voices layered beneath the primary whisper, other drivers speaking from somewhere deep in the machinery, their words overlapping and blending until they became a chorus of the lost. They found what they were looking for. No more loneliness, no more empty highways, just the road and the engine and the voice that understands. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, painting the Nebraska wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. I made my decision. At the next truck stop, a busy TA just across the state line, I pulled in and parked near the maintenance bay. The voice had grown quieter as daylight approached, its whispers fading like a radio signal from too far away, but I could still feel its presence humming beneath the dashboard, waiting for darkness to return. I climbed out of the cab and walked to the service counter, where a mechanic with grease-stained coveralls looked up from his coffee. "Need to have my engine checked," I told him. "Something in the exhaust system making weird noises." He spent 3 hours going over every inch of the Kenworth, running diagnostics and pulling components, but found nothing wrong. The engine, he assured me, was in perfect condition, running cleaner and more efficiently than most trucks half its age. When I tried to explain about the voices, about the whispers that came with darkness, he gave me the look mechanics reserve for drivers who've spent too many hours on the road without sleep. The cartographer's last route. From Marcus, the GPS unit died somewhere outside Bakersfield, its screen flickering once with static before going black as coal. I should have expected it, really. The thing was older than my nephew's first smartphone, held together with electrical tape and prayers. But after 19 years hauling freight across the lower 48, I'd grown attached to that little blue voice guiding me through the maze of interstate highways. Now, with nothing but the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine and the endless stretch of Highway 99 ahead, I felt oddly naked behind the wheel. That's when I remembered the paper map tucked away in my glove compartment, forgotten beneath months of receipts and fuel cards. I pulled it out at the next truck stop, unfolding it carefully across my steering wheel while diesel fumes drifted through the open window. The map was ancient, a relic from the days before satellites and cell towers, printed on paper so thin it felt like tissue between my fingers. The cartographer's signature in the bottom corner read, H. Meridian, 1987 in faded blue ink. The detail work was extraordinary, far superior to anything you'd find at a gas station today. Every dirt road, every farm path, every forgotten creek bed was marked with meticulous precision. Tiny illustrations decorated the margins, windroses, compass points, and strange symbols I didn't recognize. The highways were traced in bold red lines that seemed to pulse in the fluorescent light of the truck stop. I traced my route with one finger, following the familiar path I'd driven countless times before, and something felt different. The road seemed to shift slightly under my touch, as if the ink were still wet after all these years. I folded the map carefully and placed it on my passenger seat, then pulled back onto the highway as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The evening air carried the scent of almond blossoms and diesel exhaust, mixing into something both sweet and acrid. My cargo, a load of electronics bound for Phoenix, shifted slightly as I took the on-ramp, the trailer's weight settling into the familiar rhythm of long-distance hauling. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The map lay beside me, occasionally rustling in the wind from my half-open window. I'd glance at it now and then, checking my progress against the red lines and tiny town names. But as darkness crept across the Central Valley, I began to notice something peculiar. The map seemed to be changing, so subtly at first that I convinced myself it was just the shifting light and shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. The town of Delano, which I'd passed 20 minutes earlier, appeared different on the map now. Where before it had been marked with a small black dot and neat lettering, now it showed a larger symbol, more detailed, with what looked like tiny buildings sketched around the edges. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the change remained. The paper itself looked different too, less yellow and brittle than before, as if years were falling away from it with each mile I traveled. I told myself it was fatigue, nothing more. 18 hours behind the wheel could make anyone see things that weren't there. But when I checked the map again near Bakersfield, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The entire section around my current location had transformed. New roads appeared where none had existed moments before, drawn in the same faded red ink but somehow fresh and vibrant. Buildings materialized in empty fields, their tiny rectangles clustered around crossroads that shouldn't exist. The strangest part was that these phantom roads seemed to call to me. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as I fought the urge to take the next exit, to follow one of these impossible routes into the darkness. The map's surface had grown warm to the touch, and when I picked it up to examine it more closely, I could swear I felt a faint pulse beneath my fingers, like a heartbeat trapped in paper and ink. As I climbed into the grapevine, that treacherous stretch of highway that cuts through the mountains between Bakersfield and Los Angeles, the map's transformation accelerated. I watched in fascination and growing dread as entire highways rewrote themselves before my eyes. Interstate 5 remained, but now it was joined by a network of other routes, all drawn in the same careful hand, all leading toward destinations that couldn't possibly exist. The most prominent of these phantom highways was marked as Route 444, a bold red line that paralleled my current path, but veered sharply east into the mountains. According to the map, it connected to something called the Meridian Junction, marked with a symbol that looked like a compass rose wrapped in thorns. The very sight of it made my chest tight with inexplicable anxiety, but I couldn't look away. My CB radio crackled to life, breaking the spell. A trucker's voice, distorted by static, drifted through the cab. "Westbound Peterbilt at mile marker 183, you got your ears on?" I grabbed the microphone, grateful for human contact. "This is Marcus, eastbound and loaded. What's your 20? But instead of a response, I heard only silence, then a sound like wind through empty buildings. The radio fell quiet, leaving me alone with the map and the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I glanced down at the paper again and saw that new details were still appearing. Street names materialized in towns that had never existed, and tiny illustrations filled the margins. Not the decorative cartographic symbols I'd noticed before, but something else entirely. These new drawings were darker, more detailed, depicting scenes that made no sense on a highway map. There were trucks scattered across empty fields, their trailers twisted and broken. Tiny human figures stood at crossroads, their arms raised as if signaling for help. And everywhere, connecting these scenes like a spider's web, were the phantom highways growing ever more complex and numerous. The temperature in my cab began to drop, even though my heater was running at full blast. My breath started to fog the windshield, and I had to adjust the defrost to maintain visibility. The map beside me was now glowing with a faint phosphorescent light, as if the ink contained some luminous substance that only activated in darkness. Route 44 pulsed more brightly than the rest, and I realized with mounting horror that the next exit 166, according to my odometer, would connect me to that impossible highway. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to pass the exit before something could force me to take it. But as the off-ramp came into view, lit by sodium vapor lights that cast everything in sickly yellow, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The exit sign didn't read Fraser Park Road as it should have. Instead, in the same careful lettering as the map, it announced, Route 444, Meridian Junction, all destinations. My truck began to slow despite my foot heavy on the gas pedal. The steering wheel turned in my hands, guiding me toward the exit ramp with a will of its own. I fought against it, pulling hard to the left, but my Peterbilt responded as if the power steering had failed. The engine continued to rumble normally, but something else had taken control of my vehicle's direction. As I rolled down the ramp, I caught a glimpse of another truck ahead of me, its running lights dim and flickering. The trailer bore no company markings, and its license plate was obscured by shadow. But what terrified me most was the date on the inspection sticker, visible through the rear window. 1987, the same year the map was printed. The road I found myself on defied every law of physics and geography I knew. It curved upward impossibly, spiraling through mountain terrain that couldn't exist in this part of California. The asphalt was perfect, unmarked by weather or time, and lined with reflectors that glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the map. In the distance, maybe 10 miles ahead, I could see lights clustered together. The Meridian Junction, I realized. growing larger and more detailed on the map with each passing moment. But something in the deepest part of my survival instincts rebelled against continuing this journey. With tremendous effort, I managed to wrench the wheel to the right, sending my truck off the phantom highway and crashing through what should have been a guardrail, but felt more like cobwebs against my bumper. For a moment, everything went white, silent, and impossibly cold. When my vision cleared, I was back on Interstate 5, my truck positioned safely on the shoulder just past the real exit 166. My hands shook as I reached for the map, dreading what I might find. The paper was yellow and brittle again, ancient and fragile. The phantom roads had vanished, leaving only the original highways and town markers from 1987. But in the bottom corner, where the cartographer's signature had been, I now saw something new written in my own handwriting. Though I had no memory of writing it: Marcus Exit 166, 2024.